Okay, so for your second CTE, you guys were analyzing a secondary source. It was Harari's required reading for week 4 on the marriage of science and empire. So I want to go through that and talk about exactly what you should be seeing in this in terms of how the analysis of a secondary source operates, because you're going to be doing these for your annotated bibliography. Okay, so please answer the following questions as thoroughly as possible. Number 1 is, what is Harari's thesis in this chapter, as in what was he intending to prove? Quote it, give a proper internal citation with the page number, because when you cite a book, and Harari and Frankopan are both chapters from books, you need to put those page numbers in there. His thesis is located on page 278. It is literally the scientific revolution and modern imperialism were inseparable. And from that point on, he goes on throughout the rest of the chapter to demonstrate how intrinsically they were tied together. All right, what primary sources does he use? Well, the first and most significant one is Captain Cook's journals. He references those on page 276 and 277, and somewhere later in the chapter there are reference to them as well. He also, though, talks about the Tasmanian genocide on page 278, the story of the Native American and the astronauts, which I love that story, 285 to 286, Columbus's discovery of America, as it were, 286, 287, how America became America, or the Vespucci story, 287, 288, Ziggy's voyages on page 290, and then the Aztec accounts of smelly Europeans and their use of incense to cover those up. And that's on page 293. So those were all historical examples he was using, most of them drawn from primary source material, people accounting for it at the time. What other sorts of evidence does he use in this chapter to support his ideas? He definitely uses a lot of economic theory. Now, as I've said about Harari before, Harari is a scientist, so he's going to use a lot of scientific and other softer science accounts as well. So economic theory in discussing the balance of wealth and power in the world in 1775, the quote in particular, Asia accounted for 80% of the world economy. It's on page 280. He compares the Asian powers, in this case the Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, and Chinese, to the Aztec and Incas in explaining their parochial views. And what he means by this is that their idea that everything is the same as it has always been, and that they are the best they can be, and thus there's no need to look elsewhere. This is what parochial means, very self-centered or centered in the reality in your limited worldview. And he explains that that's why they were unprepared, all of them, the Asians as well as the peoples of the Western Hemisphere, unprepared for the way the Europeans were driven by curiosity and conquest. And that's one of his key elements here. It kind of goes to the idea of culture again, that there was something intrinsic in the way Europeans approached the world in this period. He explains how the Europeans used science to justify controlling other peoples, page 300 and 301. What is his explanation then for why Europe won the game of empires, and how does it compare to Frankopan's? And this is where no matter whether you're doing the discussion or you were doing the CTE, you're still using the same sourcing. Harari's arguments are here. These are different quotes that I picked out, and sorry, I didn't close that thing, that I picked out and give you the formal citation for internal citation. Europeans managed to conquer America and gain supremacy at sea, mainly because the Asiatic powers showed little interest in them, which I used also in discussing why he sees Europe that way in the PowerPoint that I did for the discussion. Modern science and capitalism, page 282 of his big things. The ability to admit ignorance, page 284, and he does a really good discussion of this. This is one of the things that sets Europeans apart from many of these other cultures. European imperialists set out to distant shores in the hope of obtaining new knowledge along with new territories. So curiosity, again, is a big part of what drives Europeans and what drives them differently from Asian peoples and from the peoples of the Western Hemisphere. The explore and conquer mentality of Europeans, page 291. he owns that the Spanish conquest of Central and South America was driven because of the natives themselves and their inability to conceive that there were people like the Spanish out there, or as he puts it, it was unimaginable that outside their domain could exist anything like the Spanish. And that's also going to play into the same thing with the Ottoman Safavids, Mughals, and Chinese on page 296. No less important was the fact that science gave the empires ideological justification for conquering. And what this means is effectively the idea that they were superior and therefore had a obligation to share their knowledge and abilities with other people while controlling them. He does discuss the development of the ideas of Aryans and tying it to racism. In that area where he discusses the bad side, basically, of science. The comparison to Frankopan. That's where I got with that. Frankopan spends a lot of time in this section talking about it as well. Okay, so Frankopan actually opens his chapter 14, The Road to Empire, with a discussion of why Europe wins the game of empires. The shift in power to the north of Europe left some unable to compete and keep up. In the Ottoman world, for instance, the number of cities with populations of more than 10,000 remained broadly the same between 1500 and 1800. There was no pressure to intensify agricultural production to service growing demand, which meant that the economy remained sluggish and static. Tax collection was also inefficient, partly as a result of tax farming, which incentivized individuals to make quick gains at the expense of the state's long-term income. So part of what Frankopan's saying here is that in the Ottoman world, particularly the Ottomans being one of the ones most reliant upon Western trade, that they didn't have the urgency to change, which kind of plays into what Harari had been saying. Frankopan then goes on to talk about the cost of maintaining the army and government bureaucracy, the more even wealth distribution in Muslim countries, where because of the nature of the religion itself, it was virtually impossible for one individual to accrue the extreme levels of wealth necessary to be able to have money to invest, or for there able to be the idea of investment companies. To be fair, this would make things more equitable in the Muslim world for the average person, but it would also mean that there are more extreme levels of wealth and poverty in Western Europe. Sorry, that should have been the end. Okay. So Frankopan spends a lot of time talking about the Muslim army and bureaucracies, which were expensive to maintain. And then, like Harari, he talks about Western curiosity. And this is a really wonderful passage on page 258. For those of a different bent who were not interested in building a bastion of austerity and religious conservatism, but wanted to discover the new, to benefit from and share in the attractions and tantalizing delights that were on offer in the world, there was an alternative: go east and head for Asia. And this is where he is saying that he's basically comparing the particularly British influx into India and Southeast Asia as opposed to the Western Hemisphere. He had opened that section comparing the Puritans basically and saying, we think a lot about people coming to the Western Hemisphere for religious freedom, but in actuality, guys like the Puritans were coming here not so much to expand or out of curiosity, but to create an insular society in which they had total control and could limit their contact with the outside world. Inversely, people who were actually really curious and were looking to benefit themselves did things like join or go to work for the East India Company, EIC, or even the VOC, the Dutch company that was also investing in Asia. And so from this point, he goes into basically a comparison of these two company structures and talks about how people could get ahead with them. And the best example he uses is Elihu Yale, who founded Yale University in what would become the United States. this particular quote, as was the case with the VOC in Holland, the lines between England's government and the EIC, East India Company, were blurred. Both companies had the right to behave as a quasi-branch of state. They were granted the right to mint coins, form alliances, and they not just maintained armed forces, but also used them. So they basically had their own little armies in India and everywhere else they went. Franklin then goes on to use Britain specifically as the example of how Europeans won the game of empires. Scholars have noted, for example, that levels of social and economic inequality were lower than in any other countries in Europe, and that the bottom tiers of the population had noticeably higher levels of calorie consumption than their continental peers. The British had lower fertility rates, which meant they had more money in fewer hands. But the trump card, as he puts it, was geography. Because Britain was an island, it didn't have to maintain a large military to protect it. And this allowed it to spend much less on military expenditure than its continental rivals. And this is particularly significant when we talk about revolutions next week, in week 5, because it's the cost of maintaining that army that is one of the problems the colonists have when the British end the 7 Years' War, but maintain the need to keep an army, a British army, in the colonies. The British also, particularly in India, assumed that everyone could be bought at the right price. This basically led to a lot of competition between the various Dutch, French, Spanish, and English emissaries there. They begin to view all Asian peoples as corrupt, as being able to be bought, and eventually that corruption will extend into the British themselves and into other representatives, because buying people leads to you being able to justify making more money and taking advantage of people as well. The word used for these people in the British circles were nabobs, who did absurdly well for themselves in Asia. They behaved like hoodlums and loan sharks, lending money locally at exorbitant rates of interest, using company resources for their own benefit, creaming the outrageous profits of transactions for themselves. So yeah, this is part of where Frankopan's arguing, again, using specifically the British as an example, but also discussing how what started out as trade eventually does become gross exploitation of local populations. It takes it about a century, but it does happen, and a lot of it is because of the wealth that many of these middle-class men from Britain are accruing when they go to Asia to work for the EIC. Like Harari, Frankopan discusses the consequence of this greed, the Bengal famine, which leads to the need for the British government to bail out the EIC. He actually uses the phrase, I think on page 270 maybe, that the EIC was too big to fail. And the way that the EIC is bailed out is that the government in Britain decides that the surplus of tea that the EIC has and desperately needs to sell in order to make up for things can be sold to the colonists in the Western Hemisphere by effectively not giving them an option to buy any other tea. This eventually leads to the Boston Tea Party, which eventually leads to the loss of the colonies to the British entirely. All right, so question 5. What is Harari's bias and what evidence do you have to support your assessment? He's definitely a scientist, as I've mentioned before, and he definitely believes in the scientific revolution. As he puts it on page 282, modern science and capitalism explain how Europeans won the game of empires. And that, again, kind of goes right back into a lot of what Frankopan's saying as well. The older empires, while controlling the world's wealth in 1775, were not interested in anything outside of what they already controlled. So their view of the world was basically parochial, which Harari had said in the earlier sections we talked about. Today, all humans are, to a much greater extent than they usually want to admit, European in dress, thought, and taste. They may be fiercely anti-European in their rhetoric, but almost everyone on the planet views politics, medicine, war, and economics through European eyes and listens to music written in European modes with European languages. Um, this is his cultural assessment of how the West has won. The Chinese and Persians did not lack technological inventions such as steam engines, which could be freely copied or bought. They lacked the values myths, judicial apparatus, and socio-political structures that took centuries to form and mature in the West, and which could not be copied or internalized rapidly. And with this quote, and that's the second time I've used it, this is his demonstration of how he views Europe as having won this game of empires, and a big part of why. Like I said, he also believes curiosity is a big part of it. So cultural values are a big part of what he's arguing. All right, those are my notes for the first CTE, or the second CTE that you did, which I hope to be grading in the near future. If you have questions, let me know. I am going to probably post this so that you can see it, and then use it so that I can say, well, did you look at my examples in question 2 for what you should be looking for in these primary source answers?